Hello, everyone, and welcome to the session. My name is Maroon. I'm the VP of Operations at Farhat Accounting Lectures, and I'm here to discuss SOC reports when a qualified or a disclaimer of opinion is being issued. In the prior sessions, we discussed the content of the unqualified SOC 1, Type 1, and Type 2 reports, and SOC 2, Type 1, and Type 2 reports. In this session, we are going to discuss the modifications to the unqualified standard reports when a qualified opinion or a disclaimer of opinion is being issued due to a scope limitation. That's why it's very important to go over the previous sessions and make sure you are familiar with the content of the SOC 1, Type 1, and Type 2 reports and the SOC 2, Type 1, and Type 2 reports when an unqualified or unmodified opinion is being issued before watching this session, because in this session, we're going to cover only the modifications to these reports without diving into the details of those reports. It is worth also mentioning that a qualified opinion may be issued in two cases. A qualified opinion may be issued when there are material misstatements in the description or material deficiencies in the design or operation of controls, and these material misstatements or deficiencies are not pervasive. The other reason would be the existence of a scope limitation, and the possible effects are material but not pervasive. In the prior session, we covered the qualified opinion issued due to material misstatements or material deficiencies. In this session, we're going to cover the issuance of qualified opinion when there is a scope limitation. First, let's start with a quick reminder of the general criteria for an unqualified opinion. The first condition is that the auditor was able to gather sufficient appropriate evidence. The second condition is that there are no material misstatements in the management's description of the service organization system. Third condition is that there are no material deficiencies in the design of controls. And the last condition is that there are no material deficiencies in the operation of the controls, which is relevant for the Type 2 report only. If one or more of the last three conditions is not satisfied, the auditor would issue either a qualified or adverse opinion, which we covered in the prior session. If the first condition is not satisfied and the auditor was unable to gather sufficient appropriate evidence, then the auditor would issue either a qualified or disclaimer, which we're going to cover in this session. Let's go ahead and get started.
Before we proceed any further, I have a public announcement about my company, farhatlectures.com.
Farhat Accounting Lectures is a supplemental educational tool that's going to help you with your CPA exam preparation as well as your accounting courses. My CPA material is aligned with your CPA review course such as Becker, Roger, Wiley, Gleam, Miles. My accounting courses are aligned with your accounting courses broken down by chapter and topics. My resources consist of lectures, multiple choice questions, true-false questions, as well as exercises. Go ahead, start your free trial today.
A service auditor would issue either a qualified or disclaimer when the auditor is unable. This is a keyword that helps us identify that there is an issue with the audit, the inability to gather sufficient appropriate audit evidence due to a scope limitation. Now, the presence of a scope limitation in and of itself doesn't necessarily lead to a modification of the report. It could be a minor scope limitation and the possible effects are not material. The possible effects of the scope limitation need to be material in order to modify the standard report. Now, when does the auditor issue a qualified opinion due to a scope limitation? When there may be undetected system description statements or deficiencies in the controls, which may be material but not pervasive. In this case, the auditor was unable to audit some aspect of the management description or the controls. However, the auditor believes that the possible effects are material, but they do not affect the whole system. Notice here the use of the word may. May be undetected system description statements may be material because the auditor doesn't know whether there are material misstatements or no. But the unaudited areas may contain material misstatements. The auditor believes, based on his professional judgment, that except for the possible effect of the matters that were unaudited, the service organization's system description is fairly stated, and there are no material deficiencies in the design or in the operating effectiveness of the controls. An example of a situation where the issuance of a qualified opinion would be appropriate is if the auditor is unable to verify certain aspects of service organization's data backup processes due to restricted access. This is the reason for the scope limitation, restricted access to some backup facilities, but has otherwise been able to adequately assess other essential controls. Here, in this case, they might issue a qualified opinion because the scope limitation is confined in one specific area and does not extend to all areas or many areas of the audit. The possible effects in this case may be material, but not pervasive. Now, when does the auditor issue a disclaimer of opinion? Again, when there is a scope limitation, but this time the potential undetected description misstatements or deficiencies in the controls may be both material and pervasive. In this case, the auditor could not perform all the audit procedures necessary for a comprehensive assessment and therefore cannot conclude whether the system is properly described or whether the controls are suitably designed or operating effectively, meaning that the auditor was unable to gather sufficient appropriate audit evidence to provide a basis for an opinion, and therefore the auditor may not issue an opinion. An example of a situation where the auditor may issue a disclaimer of opinion is when a service organization restricts access to a significant portion of its operational data or systems, preventing the auditor from performing critical evaluations or verifications. The auditor may have no choice but to issue a disclaimer of opinion, citing that the extent of the restrictions severely limits the effectiveness of the audit. The restrictions do not affect only one aspect of the audit, and the potential effects in this case might be both material and pervasive, and the issuance of a disclaimer of opinion would be appropriate. This is an example of a scope limitation imposed by the service organization. However, the scope limitations may be imposed by external circumstances, by the timing of the audit. Regardless of the reason of the scope limitation, whenever the auditor is unable to gather sufficient appropriate audit evidence and the potential effect is both material and pervasive, the auditor may not express an opinion, which is the equivalent of issuing a disclaimer of opinion. Now, what are the modifications to a standard SOC 2 report due to the issuance of a qualified opinion because of a scope limitation? Most of the report will remain the same, except for two paragraphs. The first paragraph is the service auditor's responsibilities, where the word qualified would be added before the word opinion to indicate that we're issuing a qualified opinion. So we're going to mention that the service auditor believes that the evidence the service auditor has obtained is sufficient and appropriate to provide a basis for the service auditor's qualified opinion. It's not sufficient and appropriate to provide an unqualified opinion or unmodified because we have an issue with the audit, but it's sufficient to provide a qualified opinion. The other paragraph that requires modification is the opinion paragraph, where the following should be done. First, a separate paragraph should be added before the opinion paragraph, describing the specific reasons and areas affected by the issues that led to the qualified opinion. Next, the title of the paragraph should be changed to qualified opinion. And finally, the opinion paragraph should be amended to reflect the qualification. It should state that, in our opinion, except for the possible effects of the matters described in the preceding paragraph, in all material respects, the description fairly presents the system that was designed and implemented throughout the period. The controls stated in the description were suitably designed to provide reasonable assurance that the service organization's service commitments and system requirements would be achieved, and the controls operated effectively throughout the period. These modifications are very similar to the modifications of a standard SOC 2 report when a qualified opinion is being issued due to the presence of a material misstatement or a material deficiency. The only difference is with the word possible. In this case, we don't know what are the effects of the matters described. A material misstatement or a material deficiency may exist, but we don't know about it because we were unable to audit a certain area. That's why instead of stating except for the effects of the matters described, we are saying except for the possible or potential effects of the matters described. Next, we're going to take a look at the modifications to a standard SOC 1 or SOC 2 report due to the issuance of a disclaimer of opinion. Here's where the most changes are going to happen, because the service auditor needs to inform the users that he or she was unable to audit. And this message should be consistently delivered across all the report without any conflicting messages. For example, here in the scope, the first sentence should be revised to state the following: we were engaged to examine the service organization description of its system rather than we have examined. So we were unable to audit. We did not audit. We did not examine the description because of the scope limitation. So therefore, we cannot say that we have examined. This would be a conflicting message. What the auditor should say is we were engaged in the past. We were engaged to examine, but we were unable to audit. This is the idea that's conveyed here through revising this sentence. Regarding the service auditor's responsibilities, the auditor is going to omit a lot of wording in this paragraph to make it clear that the auditor was unable to audit and the audit was not completed. The report will only indicate the following: our responsibility is to express an opinion on the fairness of the presentation of the description and the suitability of the design and operating effectiveness based on conducting the examination in accordance with attestation standards established by the AICPA. That's it. We're done here. The following statements will be omitted. What the standards require of the service auditor: the service auditors believe that the evidence gathered is sufficient and appropriate. Because the auditor was unable to gather sufficient appropriate evidence in this case, the list of procedures performed as part of the examination engagement, because the auditor did not perform procedures. Even if the auditor performed some of the procedures, the auditor may not say that in the report. The user should be informed that no procedures were performed, no evidence was gathered, and as a result, no opinion was expressed. Continuing with the modifications, the description of test of controls, we did not perform any tests, so it should be omitted. In the opinion paragraph, we have a lot of changes also. A separate paragraph should be added before the opinion paragraph, describing the scope limitation and the issues that led to the disclaimer of opinion. The title of the paragraph definitely should be changed. It's a disclaimer. The auditor's opinion should be amended to reflect the disclaimer of opinion, stating that because of the limitation on the scope of our examination discussed in the preceding paragraph, the scope of our work was not sufficient to enable us to express, and here is the most important part, we do not express an opinion on whether the description is fairly presented or the controls were suitably designed or operating effectively. We're not going to provide any opinion because we were unable to audit. And as you notice, the disclaimer of opinion report is the shortest report. It's clear and concise. We're just stating that we were unable to gather enough evidence, sufficient appropriate evidence, and therefore we're not providing an opinion. Finally, we still have to restrict the use of the report, sign it, include the city and state, and date the auditor's report. Now, what happens if the service auditor issues either a qualified or disclaimer because the auditor is unable to gather sufficient appropriate audit evidence due to a scope limitation and identifies at the same time material misstatements or material deficiencies? Now, this should not be pervasive, or else the auditor would have issued an adverse opinion. The service auditor should include in separate paragraphs of the report a clear explanation of both the nature of the scope limitation that led the auditor to modify the opinion and the identified material misstatements in the description or material deficiencies in the suitability of the design or operating effectiveness. Since they are important for the user's understanding of the service organization system, we cannot ignore them, even though we issued a qualified or disclaimer due to the presence of a scope limitation. Now, this is an example of a scope limitation paragraph added before the opinion paragraph. During our engagement, we were unable to evaluate all aspects of the entity's information security controls due to restrictions imposed by the client. This is the scope limitation. Specifically, access to the live data environment was denied on the grounds of protecting proprietary information and safeguarding sensitive data. This limitation has prevented us from conducting a comprehensive assessment of certain data security controls. So this is the scope limitation, and this is what was the result of the scope limitation. We were unable to perform all the audit procedures that we were supposed to perform. In the next paragraph, the auditor would be building on this scope limitation paragraph in order to express the opinion, which is either a qualified or a disclaimer. Now, the separate paragraph is not only added before the opinion paragraph when there is a scope limitation, but also with any type of report with a modified opinion. As we saw in the previous session, also when we issue a qualified opinion or adverse opinion due to material misstatements or material deficiencies, we're going to add also a separate paragraph before the opinion. Let's look at a couple of examples related to the wording in these paragraphs. Well, they depend on the type of the material misstatement or material deficiency. For example, here, in the system description provided by the service organization, it is claimed that biometric authentication methods are utilized to prevent unauthorized access to the system. Is this claim true? Well, certainly no, because this is the reason that we're adding this paragraph and we're qualifying or issuing an adverse opinion, because the audit revealed that while the security measures are effectively employed in applications alpha and beta, they are notably absent in applications gamma and delta. This is a material misstatement in the description that can lead either to a qualified or adverse opinion based on the auditor's professional judgment regarding the extent of this misstatement. The other sample paragraph that we're going to be looking at is because of a material misstatement in the design of controls, we're changing our opinion. And the issue is that the system description provided by the service organization asserts that comprehensive data integrity and backup procedures are in place to ensure the availability and accuracy of data. However, the audit revealed that the backup processes lack mandatory verification steps to ensure that backups are complete and can be successfully restored. So here we have an issue with the design of the controls. There are no controls in place to verify or to ensure that backups are complete and can be successfully restored. This issue was observed consistently throughout the audit period. The absence of these verification procedures jeopardizes the system's ability to ensure data availability. The data availability is one of the trust services criteria, which requires that the entity maintain the accessibility of information systems and protect against system failures. The service organization did not adhere to this trust services criteria, and the auditor will modify their opinion because of the materiality of this design deficiency. Finally, let's try this multiple choice question from farhatlectures.com. Which of the following scenarios is most likely to lead to the issuance of a qualified opinion or a disclaimer in a SOC report due to a scope limitation? A, the service audit identifies material deficiencies in the implementation of controls that were suitably designed. Is the identification of material deficiencies a scope limitation? No, it is not. This is a reason to issue either a qualified opinion or an adverse opinion, depending on the pervasiveness of this material deficiency. B, in a SOC 1 Type 1 engagement, the service auditor assessed the suitability of the design of the service organization's controls, but did not perform any tests of their operating effectiveness. Is the auditor required to perform tests of the operating effectiveness of controls in a type 1 engagement? Well, no. Only in a type 2 engagement, the auditor would be required to do so. And therefore, in this case, there is no scope limitation. The auditor has performed the audit by assessing the suitability of the design. We do not have any indication of a scope limitation here. If it was a type 2 engagement, then the auditor would be unable to issue an opinion. C, the service auditor finds evidence of potential conflicts of interest among management, but cannot assess their significance to the service organization's operations. Is it part of the procedures that a service auditor would perform in a SOC engagement? No, the auditor has nothing to do with the conflicts of interest among management. This is not a criteria to express an opinion. The auditor is expressing an opinion on the service organization system, the controls, not expressing an opinion about the relationship between management members. Finally, the audit team encounters restrictions that prevent them from accessing critical data necessary to evaluate the effectiveness of the controls. Here it is evident that this answer choice relates to a scope limitation, and the scope limitation is affecting the auditor's ability to perform the examination, and therefore this is the right answer. The auditor would issue either a qualified opinion or a disclaimer of opinion based on the pervasiveness of the potential effect of the matter at hand. What should you do now? You should go to Farhat Lectures and look for additional multiple choice questions and additional resources to help you with your exam preparation. Thank you for watching and happy study.